Hi, this is Dr. Kingston, and in this video, we'll be talking about the hard palate. Specifically, we are going to describe the composition and neurovascular supply of the hard palate, talk about what bones make it up, what nerves provide sensory innervation, and what arteries supply this area. All right, the hard palate is hard specifically because it's supported by a plate of bone. And it's that same plate of bone that separates the oral cavity from the nasal cavity. Most of this is made up by the palatine process of the maxilla. So all of this here, right down to this section that we see down here, is going to be the maxilla. Posterior to that, and you can tell here where we have this transition from a rugose bone to a much smoother bone here. This is the horizontal plate of the palatine bone. So maxilla up front, palatine in the... Now, because it's bony, any neurovasculature that travels through the hard palate will have to tunnel its way. So we see three sets of foramina here. Anteriorly, there is one incisive foramen, and then posteriorly, we have two foramina. We've got a greater palatine and a lesser palatine on each side. Neurovasculature that travels through the greater palatine foramen supplies the hard palate, and stuff traveling through that lesser palatine foramen is for the soft palate. We're going to focus just on the structures for the hard palate here and talk about the soft palate later on. The neurovasculature that travels through these foramina is for the mucosa of the hard palate. Mucosa, or mucous membrane, receives both somatic sensation and a little bit of parasympathetic secretomotor for its mucus glands. The region of the face that the hard palate sits in is supplied by the maxillary nerve and the maxillary artery. So remember, territory for V2 maxillary nerve is upper lip through the lower eyelid. So everything that we see here is going to be branches of a maxillary something or other. All right, as far as the nerves go, the maxillary nerve meets up with the pterygopalatine ganglion right as it exits foramen rotundum, and then it picks up postganglionic parasympathetics for the lacrimal gland, but also a couple for nasal and palatine glands here too. So in this image on the left, right here, we can see the pterygopalatine ganglion, and we can see a number of branches extending downward from that. These are branches of the maxillary nerve. And one of these, the greater palatine nerve, is going to run down through the greater palatine foramen, and it is going to serve the posterior and middle aspects of the hard palate, right up to the end of the premolars. Okay? Anteriorly, then, we had that incisive foramen up here. Remember that? That area is served by the nasopalatine nerve. So I'm going to bring it over to the right. This is also a branch from the maxillary nerve, but instead of running down through this canal, this greater palatine canal here, it runs across the septum of the nose. Okay, so there's one of these on each side of the septum, and these run down until they're sitting just above that anterior portion right behind the teeth. Then they burrow their way down through the hard palate to supply innervation to the anterior portion of the hard palate behind the incisors and medial to the canine teeth. Blood supply to the hard palate comes from the maxillary artery, which is one of the terminal branches of the external carotid. It dives deep into the cheek in the infratemporal fossa, and the very tail end of it enters into the pterygopalatine fossa. So I know these are places we have not really gone into yet, but we can see the pterygopalatine fossa here. It's been chipped into through the lateral wall of the nasal cavity here, and that's where we saw the pterygopalatine ganglion sitting. All right, so it's in a good position here to send some branches traveling down to the hard palate alongside branches of the maxillary nerve here. And that's exactly what we see. The major branch heading down toward the palate is the descending palatine artery, which will divide then into branches for both the hard and soft palate. The branch for the hard palate is very nicely the greater palatine artery, and the branch for the soft palate is going to be the lesser palatine artery. Okay, so no big naming surprises here. The greater palatine artery is going to serve that same region that the greater palatine nerve did, so the posterior and middle part of the hard palate. And then the anterior, very similarly to the nerve again. Here we have the remaining body of the sphenopalatine artery after it has given off some branches in the nasal cavity. That is going to travel down the septum with that nasopalatine nerve, dive through that incisive canal and foramen, and then it will serve the anterior portion of the hard palate, just like the nasopalatine nerve did. All right, and just to give you a better idea of the territories for these nerves and blood vessels, rather than my little laser pointer on here, I've mapped out where they end up on the palate here. So anteriorly, in green, you can see the territory supplied by the nasopalatine nerve and the sphenopalatine artery. So both of these will travel down the nasal septum and through the incisive foramen, which brings them in right here at that incisive foramen. The rest of the palate then is all supplied by the greater palatine artery and nerve. And those will pass through the greater palatine foramen and then distribute anteriorly up through the premolars. And that is the end of the hard palate. Here's your review question. A lesion of the nasopalatine nerve as it travels through the maxilla would result in reduced innervation to the palate lingual to which teeth? So on the tongue side. So the correct answer here is A, the central incisor. So the nasopalatine nerve, again, traveling down the nasal septum through the incisive canal and incisive foramen, will only innervate the mucosa directly lingual to the incisors and canine tooth. And that brings us to the end. Thank you very much for joining me.